In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the intake manifold gaskets on this Ford Flex with a 3.5 liter naturally aspirated engine. As you can see, there are a lot of them, and you want to make sure you get them all when you pull the intake off. So let's get started. The first thing you want to do for this job is actually drain the coolant, and you'll do that through the petcock, which is located right here. Go ahead and loosen it up, and with a collection bucket underneath, let all the coolant drain until it stops. Once it's done, tighten up the petcock again so you can make sure it doesn't keep leaking. If you have an engine cover, go ahead and remove it. Ours is missing, so we're going to move on to removing the intake. First, grab this hose. This goes to the coolant overflow, and just pull it aside like this. Then we have this vacuum line right here. Pull it out of the retainers over here, but be very careful because it's plastic, it's not rubber, so you don't want to snap it and break it. You'll have to replace it if you do. There we go. Now this is released from here. Now let's unplug some connectors over here. Start with this one, set it aside, and you have this line here. On the back side, right here, you have these tabs. You want to pinch them in just like this. As you pinch it, you want to push it out like that. There you go. Set this aside also, but again, this is the plastic line, so don't go too far because it will break. Let's unplug the throttle body connection here. Sometimes you'll need a little prying device to help you pry the red lock. Press on the connector and slide it off. Now release the clamp that holds this intake tubing onto the throttle body. Make sure it moves. If you can't pull it off, probably needs to be unthreaded a little more. Okay, leave it just like this. Follow the intake further, and you'll see that this hose for the PCV is connected to it, or this line. Move this clip back and forward, kind of like this. It should hold it in the unlocked position, so you can pull this off and just set it aside for now. Right over here, there's another clamp, 8mm socket also. Just loosen it up a little bit, unthread the bolt, and this should allow you to pull this assembly out of the way here. Okay, just like that. Looks like we have a hose attached over here. So I'm going to unplug it from here. This should be able to slide up now. Set this aside. Unclamp this hose. Use some pliers and twist the hose clamp this way so I can grab it. But once you get the hose clamp released, you should be able to pull the hose off. Sometimes these are a little tight, so just there we go. Once if you squeeze it enough, this one actually has a lock on it, so you can lock it in the open position and just leave it like that until you're ready to reinstall. A lot of times these rubber hoses will get stuck on here, so use something to very gently pry it, give it a couple twists, and it should break free and pop off here. There we go. Set that aside over here. Make sure the clamp doesn't fall off. Now we're ready to pull the intake off, and we just have to unbolt it at this point. There is one more hose connected to the backside, but we can't get to it until we pull it off a little bit. So there is a sequence to removing this intake. You start at this bolt right here, which is in the center, in the front, but towards the driver's side. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you jump over to the driver's side, skip over this one, 5, 6, and then go back to this one for 7. I'm going to break them free first using an 8mm socket, and then once they're broken free in this sequence, I'm going to pull them off completely. Okay, now let's remove the bolts completely. It's important to follow the sequence so that you don't potentially damage the intake. You don't want to crack it by accident. Okay, these don't come out, they stay in the intake. So right down here, between the throttle body and the intake, you'll see another 8mm bolt. You can actually easily reach it underneath the throttle body and break it free. We'll have to remove this one. This is the last thing holding the intake on. Okay, that's broken free. Okay, try not to drop the bolt. At this point, the intake should be unbolted and ready to pull up and out. If you have a lot of debris here, I know I have some leaves here, but they're not here, they're underneath, so I'm not going to worry about them yet. If you do have a lot of debris, like I said, just blow it off or vacuum it at this point. We can pull the intake up, and you're going to have to get this wiring out of the way here. Looks like it's clipped onto the intake. Pry the retainer out. Slide the intake back a little bit, and that's only so you can clear these hoses, lines, and wires, and then slide it up and forward, but don't go too far because we still have this hose at the back here. And to disconnect that easily, just grab some pliers, pinch the hose clamp, squeeze it, slide it off, and then move the hose off of here. You can use pliers or a little prying tool to help you slide it off. Set this aside. Now let's unbolt this bracket that is bolted onto the head here that holds the fuel rail. 8mm socket, remove the bolt completely. Set this aside safely. Now let's unplug the fuel injectors. They're these right here, right underneath the fuel rail. There's a locking clip on them. Sometimes they're a little hard to get. If you can't get them by hand because they're stuck, which a lot of times they are, you could just use some pliers and very gently pinch it and grab it, slide it up and out. Usually the pliers give you a little more leverage on the locking retainer there. But be very gentle if you use pliers. You don't want to break the connectors. Now do the same on the back side here. There should be 3 on the front and 3 on the back. Okay, with those set aside, we can unbolt the 4 8mm bolts that hold these fuel rails onto the engine. Okay, be very careful not to drop anything down here. If you wanted to, you could put some rags down here and just cover up the intake port holes. Don't stuff the rag all the way down, but this will prevent debris from getting in there as we pull up the fuel rail. Okay. Now we can lift the fuel rail up. Keep in mind the fuel rails might be kind of stuck here because of the O-rings on the injectors. There's nothing else holding this on, but even though it moves, it might not pop out. Try to avoid prying it. Prying it could either damage whatever you're prying on or could break the injector. So if possible, don't use a pry bar or a screwdriver or anything like that. Just kind of wiggle it back and forth and put some upwards pressure on it by hand in order to break this free. It should eventually pop out. Okay. Once you work it enough, you'll get one out. Therefore, the next one will want to pop up. We just have one left on this side. You can sometimes spray a little bit of brake parts cleaner down there This will help lubricate the O-rings, and I know what you're thinking, brake parts cleaner dries stuff out, but in this case, it actually will help the O-rings, and this is also what we're going to use to reinstall when the time comes. Okay. There we go. Now one popped out as well. Perfect. So now we just have to do this one in the rear here. Try to give these a couple twists, wiggle them back and forth. This part of the rail is done. And hopefully this gives us more wiggle room for the rear. I'll spray these as well. Oh, this one popped out. Perfect. One more. Yeah, all right. The O-ring on that one stayed in there, but that's okay. We have new O-rings anyway. Now we just have to pull this up and out, set it aside. Can't go too far with it because this is a hard line, but there is a hose right by that bracket that we unbolted, so at this point we can just do this with it and set it to the side. Two 8mm bolts hold this thermostat housing in place onto the lower intake. I'm not going to remove any of these hoses because we're not removing the thermostat housing. I just want to pull it away and separate it from the intake. So get your 8mm socket on here, break these free. With this one broken free, I'm going to switch to this one. That way I loosen them evenly. Because there are only two, I don't want to put pressure sideways on this housing or on the lower intake. I want them loosened up evenly. All right, I have a collection bucket underneath just in case some more coolant drips out. It might or it might not. That's one. And two down here. They're both the same. You don't have to worry about mixing them up or putting them back in the same threaded area that they came from. Set those aside and you can pull this back. There we go. That's all we needed, just a little bit of separation. Now let's remove the lower intake. Same as for the upper, I'm going to break the bolts free first in the proper sequence. That's basically going from the center out, starting on one side and then crossing over, and then I'll remove them all the way. Okay, that's all of them. Now let's remove them completely. Before we completely pull the lower intake out, if you have any debris along where it meets the engine, just remove it, and you definitely want to make sure it doesn't get inside the cylinders. Having said that, let's pull this up, break it free. The gaskets are probably going to be somewhat stuck on there, so just wiggle it back and forth. Okay, there we go. Apply some pressure, and you should be able to slide it right up and out. There it is, and those are the gaskets that we're after. So here we have the upper, the lower intake, and all of the new gaskets. I'm just going to start over here and pull them all off, clean the area, and put all the new ones on. You can take a pick and start removing the gasket. Hopefully yours comes out in one piece. A lot of times when they get old and brittle, they start breaking. Just make sure that if they do break, they don't go into the runners. If it does, try to shake it out, vacuum it, do whatever you have to do, blow compressed air in, but you don't want this getting sucked up into the engine. So set this aside. Let's do the same over here. Get all of the old gaskets off so we can do all of the cleaning at once. We're gonna have to clean all the little cutouts where the gaskets sit so that the new ones can seal up perfectly. Okay. All right, now with all of the gaskets off here, I know we still have the throttle body gasket, but we'll save that for later. Let's clean off everything. Depending on how much buildup of either corrosion or debris or oil you have here, you can just take a rag and take your pick and kind of slide it in through here and clean it up. Or you can spray it with brake parts cleaner, which I might do, but for now, the rag and the pick is perfectly fine. I just want to soak up all the oil. I don't actually have a lot of debris in these little channels where the seals sit. I just want to soak up the oil that's there so the new seals can press up against the intake nicely and seal up. Now let's put the new gaskets in. I'm going to start with these, well, they look square, but they're actually slightly rectangular. This is a longer side, this is a shorter side. Make sure that you line them up so that they match perfectly. As you can see, this one lines up perfect, but if I spin it the other way, it doesn't sit quite right. You don't want to put it in that way. It'll be under some tension and it won't seal up perfectly. So I like to start with these, that way these are done, and then these that go on the lower intake that press onto the head are pretty self-explanatory as to how they go in because they're directional and they're all the same. So as long as you line them up, just press them in, make sure they're nice and flush, and just do all of them. Now let's move on to the upper intake. This is just one large piece that's interconnected. If it doesn't fit, that means it's upside down, so just spin it around until you find the right side to put it in, and there we go. That's all set. Now let's replace the throttle body gasket. 4 8mm bolts holding this on. Remove all 4. There we go. This is the gasket that we are replacing. Take a pick it out of here. Clean off this area if needed. Just get the oil out of there. Take the new gasket, slide it on. Going to want to stretch just a tiny bit. That's normal. Make sure it's seated all the way around. Take the throttle body. All the bolts are still in it. Make sure you put it on the right way, not upside down, because the bolts will fit. They're a perfect square, but it's not going to necessarily line up the right way. Start them on by hand. That way they don't cross thread. I'm going to bottom them out with this, but then I'll come back and torque them properly. Go in a cross pattern so that the gasket can squish evenly. .89 inch-pounds is the torque for this. Don't confuse that with foot-pounds. That'll completely snap this off. So go in a cross pattern. If you don't have a 1/4 inch torque wrench, that'll do this, or even a 3/8. Some will go that low. Just make it nice and snug by hand. I'm going to go back one more time and double check them, because with rubber gaskets like this, sometimes when they squish, it'll loosen up the first bolt that you tighten. But for me, it looks like these are all perfectly tightened to 89 inch-pounds, so this is all set. Now let's remove this hose that goes onto the crossover tube. We'll have to pull the tube out, and that requires disconnecting one of these two connections here. You can either pinch the white clip and pull the whole fitting off, or disconnect the hose off of the fitting. You choose whatever you want to do, but I will take the hose off of the fitting because a lot of times these fittings break and I don't want to disturb this connection here, which is going to be weaker, the seal especially, than the hose with the clamp. Having said that, I'm going to get my hose clamp pliers on the clamp so I can squeeze it. As you can see, the hose is already moving. Try to get the clamp down. And then I can just let go of the clamp over here and just grab the hose and pull it right off. Now the coolant temp sensor here is actually wrapped around this crossover pipe, and I want to get it out of my way, so I'm going to unplug it, move it up and over this way, and I'm just going to leave it over here, plug it back in. It doesn't need to be wrapped around that way, but I did have to get it out of my way. Okay, make sure that clicks. Now pull back on this crossover tube. Coolant will come out in the center there. If you have coolant down there, which you most likely do, you want to make sure you absorb it up with something, or vacuum it if you have a vacuum that can suck up liquid. Just make sure you don't use a dry vacuum for this. But either way, you want to get it out of here. You don't want to leave it here because two things. One, it's liquid that sits here. It can cause some damage over time. But also, as the engine gets hot, you're actually going to smell this as it evaporates. And you don't want to confuse the smell of this with a coolant leak if you actually have one, but also it's not good to breathe this in. So you want to make sure you get it all out of here. I'm using some absorbent pads. It's not going to be perfect. I just want the majority of this coolant out of here. Now let's replace this O-ring. Grab it with a pick, slide it over like that, pick it out from in there. Don't leave it. Make sure this area is clean here. A lot of times corrosion will build up here, and if that's the case, use a wire brush, or you might even have to replace the tube if it's really bad. Regardless, get the new O-ring, slide it over. Try not to break it when you slide it over like this. It should seat itself in place perfectly all around. That's great. Now let's set this down in place. Make sure there's no debris down there. Now line up the crossover tube over there. Make sure that area is clean. I already double checked it. Slide it in. If the O-ring is lubricated with coolant, that's actually perfect because it'll just fall right into place. Now let's plug in the coolant temp sensor. Make sure the connector clicks. There we go. Set the wire down here out of the way of the intake. Let's get this hose back on. Make sure it's bottomed out all the way. Grab the clamp, slide it back on. Usually I like to put the clamps right back in their same position that they came from, but in this case, because it's all the way underneath, I'm actually going to set it to the side right here. That way it's a lot easier to access next time. Now let's replace this gasket right here that goes on the thermostat housing. Grab a pick and take it out. Grab your new one, line it up, slide it in place here. Make sure this is even all the way around when you're done. Now let's clean up this area where the lower intake will mount. Sometimes you'll have built up corrosion here, and you want to use a razor blade to clean it. You can use a sanding block if you want, but you have to be very careful. First of all, make sure it's perfectly flat. Second of all, use very fine grit sandpaper, 400 grit or higher. Don't use anything coarse because it'll create grooves in this material and then it won't seal up. I prefer to use a razor blade because it's flat and it's gentle. So just scrape off all this corrosion here. Try not to get it inside the portholes. My area is actually somewhat clean. I don't have a lot of debris to scrape off, but just go around, do all 6 of the runners, and then we'll put the intake on. Also get around here. These are coolant ports on both sides. Obviously, once again, make sure you don't scrape stuff inside. If a little bit falls in, that's fine. Use some compressed air, blow it out, or use a vacuum and suck it up, but it's not the end of the world. on the lower intake, this right here is where the thermostat housing bolts up with that gasket, so make sure this isn't rusted. I know I have a little bit of rust here, but actually the seal goes right on this black part that's painted, so I'm good to go. If you do have a lot of rust buildup, you're probably going to need a lower intake. Having said that, let's slide this in, pull the fuel rail with the injectors up and out of the way as much as you can. As you slide this down, try not to catch any of those gaskets and tear them or make them fall out of place. And be as gentle as possible so you don't damage the injectors either. Okay, slide this down into place and just try to line up the bolt holes the best you can. Looks like everything lines up for me, so that's great. So now let's put the bolts in for the intake to make sure everything is centered up. Let's start in all of the bolts by hand. Doesn't matter what sequence you use for putting them in, it just matters how you tighten them. So I'm just gonna go around, start on one end. The more bolts you line up and put in, the more likely it is for the rest of them to line up. Make sure you're not cross-threading any of these. All right, they're all started. Now I'm gonna snug them up in the correct sequence, which I'll mention in a second. And then after I snug them, I will then go around again and torque them to the proper torque spec. Now let's snug up the intake bolts. You want to go in the same sequence that we did to loosen them up. So start in the middle, go across, and just work your way towards the outer ones. I'm not torquing them yet. The torque will come after they're snug. I just want to bottom them out and hold the intake nice and tight. As you can see, it still has some play at this point, and we want to eliminate that. Try and hold it as centered as possible. Now, torque it to 89 inch-pounds, and that converts to 7.4 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench that actually goes that low, just make them nice and snug with a short ratchet. All right, now I'm going to go over one more time because a lot of times with rubber gaskets like this, as you tighten the last few, the first few that you tightened actually get loose because the rubber squishes and creates more slack. So it's always a good idea to double check them. You don't necessarily have to go in the same sequence this time, but you can if you want to. As you can see, this one needed a little bit more to be fully tightened to the spec provided. All the other ones seem good, but I'm still going to double check them. There we go. Let's reconnect the thermostat housing. Put the two bolts in. There we go. Bottom these out and then torque them to 89 inch-pounds. Okay, 89 inch-pounds. That's torqued. Now let's replace the injector O-rings, which you should do every time you pull the injectors out. I'm going to grab a pick and remove the old injector O-ring here. Take that off, inspect the injector, make sure it's clean. Ours is. I'm going to hit it with a little bit of brake parts cleaner. This is going to do two things. One, it'll clean off any debris that's here, and two, it'll actually lubricate the O-ring and allow it to slide on a lot easier, just like that. Do the same to all the other ones. Now let's put the fuel rail on, line it up. As you slide it down, make sure that all the holes for the fuel injectors are clean. There's no debris in there. Okay, that's lined up. To slide them all in, I'm going to spray brake parts cleaner on all of them. And now, there we go. Nice light push. Should get them all seated perfectly. Let's get the bolts in. Starting by hand. Try to hold these pretty much centered and snug these up. Make sure these are nice and snug. Give them about a quarter turn after they bottom out. Perfect. Let's secure the line. Make sure it's twisted the right way. There we go. Let's reconnect the fuel injectors. Make sure they click. You don't want these coming off of here by themselves as the vehicle is running. Can't see anything here. Now let's get the upper intake on. Make sure all the gaskets are still in position. Mine are. Before we completely put it on, we need to reattach this hose at the back here. It'll be a lot easier to do it now rather than after this is already in. So make sure it's bottomed out completely. Just like that. Now let's grab some pliers, get that clamp on. Position it right about where it was before. Now we can line up the rest of the intake with the lower intake. Make sure you don't pinch any wires or hoses in here. Get these out of the way. There we go. That lines up perfectly right there. Manually start in the bolts so that you can make sure that not only are they not cross-threading, but if they all start in, you know you're perfectly lined up, so you have nothing else to worry about. Okay, one more over here, and one more back here. Okay, before I attach anything else, I'm going to tighten this down so that other than that hose in the back, nothing is putting pressure on it. Not that the hoses or the wires would put pressure on it, but I just want it to seat perfectly, and I want to know that it's installed fully. I'm going to snug these down with my 8mm socket, and then the sequence for this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then cross over 5, 6, and then back to the middle, number 7. Remember, there is one more bolt that goes underneath the throttle body all the way in the back on that bracket, but we'll worry about that later. That one is not part of the sequence. Just make them snug. I'm not torquing them yet. Double check the first few. Okay, now let's torque them to 89 inch-pounds in the same sequence. And then we'll do an additional 45 degrees after the 89 inch-pounds. 89 inch-pounds is about 7.4 foot-pounds. That's 89 inch-pounds for all of them, but I will go over it again because as with all rubber gaskets, the first few might loosen up as you tighten the last few. And because we have degrees involved to finish torquing them, you want to make sure that your base torque, which is a foot-pound number, is correct. If your initial torque or the base torque is not right, once you do the degrees, the ones that are not properly tightened will be off to a different final torque. I have a torque wrench that reads degrees, so I have it set to 45 degrees, but if you don't have this, you can just use a ratchet or a little breaker bar and go 1/8 of a turn. You can either mark the bolt or just visually look at it as you're turning. That's it right there. Same sequence. At this point, they're all torqued. You don't want to touch the bolts anymore. If you doubt yourself, you're going to have to loosen them up and start all over again. If you continue tightening or even loosening at this point, you completely ruin the procedure that we just did. And the final torque will be out of spec. Underneath the throttle body, if you follow it, it's very difficult to see, but there's going to be that bracket that had a bolt going through it. We removed it with an extension, slide that bolt in, get this started, bottomed out, and tightened down. That's nice and snug. Let's reconnect all the connectors and hoses around the throttle body here. Connect the throttle body itself. Make sure that clicks. You didn't hear it, I didn't hear it, but I felt it. Lock the connector in. Now let's put this hose back on this valve here. Lock it down and connect the electrical connector for it. Make sure that clicks. Next we had a vacuum hose over here. Slide that over, bottom it out all the way. Let's get this clamp back on here, lock that hose on. This was just pointed down over here. This coolant hose that goes across was secured on these plastic retainers, and then this vacuum line, actually it's just a plastic line, secures itself onto the retainers on the fuel rail. Let's put the air intake duct back. Slide it over the air filter housing and make sure that on the bottom this lip doesn't roll over. You want it to seat on the housing just like this. There we go, press it on all the way. Now on this side, put it over the throttle body. Once again, make sure it seats. All the way around, just like this. Give it a couple spins to ensure. This hose goes back on here. This one back on here. Make sure this clicks. Now with this situated properly, let's tighten up the two hose clamps. 8mm socket. One over here. Don't make them very tight, just snug. These strip out easily, and once they do, you have to replace it with a new one. Just like that. Perfect. Now if you had an engine cover, you'd put it back on. It goes onto these grommets here, but ours is missing, so we don't have anything to put back on. Now let's fill the cooling system. You can see the maximum and minimum lines on the reservoir are here and here. You want it to be between these two once you're done. However, we do have to bleed it. So I'm going to go to right above the maximum line. Then once we bleed it, most likely the air is going to make up for that difference. It'll suck the coolant in, bleed the air out, and then the level should hopefully be right in between these two. If it's too low, obviously add some. If it's too high, you're going to want to drain some either through the radiator, or you can suck some out through here if you have a turkey baster that you use for removing fluids or a fluid extraction pump. Check your owner's manual. If you're not sure what kind of coolant to use, make sure you use the manufacturer's recommended type. I filled it up to here, which is slightly above the maximum, like I said, but I'm going to run the vehicle and the air will get pushed out, the fluid will get drawn in. So let's do that. Now that we've ran the vehicle, the coolant is pretty much right at the maximum line. So double check yours, like I said, add if necessary. Cap this off and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.